Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a stack of sources here today centered around a story that is, frankly, just devastating. It really weaves together sudden, immense wealth, systemic injustice, brutal betrayal, murder on a horrific scale, and it even touches on the surprising origins of a legendary federal agency. You send us excerpts from David Grann's book, Killers of the Flower Moon, and diving into this source material, it feels like stepping back into a specific, really brutal period of American history in the 1920s. It feels distant in time, but the themes, wow, they feel incredibly relevant today. So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack the key events, understand the incredible scale of the injustice faced by the Osage Nation, and see how this dark period shaped the future, not just for the Osage, but for federal law enforcement too.
That's exactly right. We're looking at events centered primarily in Osage County, Oklahoma. This all follows the discovery of, vast oil reserves on land the Osage Nation had been pushed onto. It's really a story of how this sudden, immense wealth became a magnet for just immense evil. The sources show us how vulnerabilities within the system were ruthlessly exploited and how individuals were targeted with just chilling efficiency. We're going to trace those threads as they're revealed in the material you provided.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What immediately jumps out from the sources is the sheer, almost unbelievable scale of the wealth the Osage Nation suddenly possessed.
Absolutely. I mean, the history is that the Osage were forced from their ancestral lands in Kansas onto this rocky, supposedly undesirable reservation in northeastern Oklahoma back in the 1870s.
Right, land that everyone thought was basically worthless. And decades later, surprise, surprise, that very land turned out to be sitting on top of some of the richest oil pools in the United States. And crucially, the Osage Nation retained the subsurface mineral rights. So, to get that oil, prospectors had to pay the Osage Nation directly for leases and royalties.
And this wasn't just pocket change we're talking about.
Okay.
The sources detail that by the early 20th century, every single person on the tribal roll began receiving these quarterly checks. Initially small, yes, but those payments grew incredibly rapidly.
I mean, look at this number here in the source. By 1923 alone, the tribe collectively took in more than $30 million.
$30 million back then.
Which is the equivalent of over $400 million today. It's astonishing. The Osage were actually considered the wealthiest people per capita in the world.
That level of wealth on tribal land was completely unprecedented. You know, there's a quote in the source material from a New York weekly called Outlook that really captures the shock at the time.
Oh, yeah.
It exclaims, "Lo and behold, the Indian, instead of starving to death, enjoys a steady income that turns bankers green with envy." It just underlines how and unexpected this shift was for the outside world.
But this sudden vast wealth, while absolutely the right of the Osage, also painted a huge target on their backs, didn't it?
Precisely. As one Osage chief, Bacon Rind, is quoted protesting, "Everybody wants to get in here and get some of this money." And that desire, it manifested in incredibly sinister ways.
The sources really start to zero in on Mollie Burkhart and the devastating losses she suffered personally. Her family became kind of central to this wave of violence.
And he learned Mollie was a registered member of the tribe, just like her sisters, and possessed a fortune through her headright.
Right, the headright. Can you just quickly explain that?
Yeah, sure. It was essentially an inheritable share of the tribe's collective oil royalties. So having a headright meant you had a direct claim on this immense wealth. And Mollie, she also held on to many traditional Osage customs, wearing Indian blankets, keeping her long hair.
Yeah.
She was navigating both worlds.
The material mentions that years before the main events chronicled, Mollie's sister Minnie died young. The report was a peculiar, wasting illness. But even then, the source says Mollie had doubts. That detail, mentioned early on, it's like one of the first hints the sources give us about potential suspicious deaths that might have predated the more overt murders later.
It absolutely plants a seed, doesn't it? And then in May 1921, Mollie's other sister, Anna, vanished.
Okay.
I was younger, recently divorced, and the sources describe her as kind of struggling, spending time in the reservations, tumultuous boom towns. Can you even imagine the chaos?
Right.
A government official reported finding gambling, drinking, adultery, lying, thieving, murdering in a place called Whizbang. Just total chaos.
Wow. Mollie last saw Anna at her house. Anna arrived unsteady, drunk, carrying a flask of bootleg whiskey, and you have to remember, this is a year into Prohibition.
Right. So alcohol's illegal, but flowing freely, especially in those boom towns.
Yeah, and a servant is quoted describing Anna as someone who drank a lot and had very loose morals with white men. That's the quote.
So Mollie became incredibly anxious when Anna didn't return home. She sent her husband, Ernest Burkhart, to check, but Anna's house was locked up tight, dark.
Then the horrifying discovery started. A week later, a body was found near an oil derrick north of Pawhuska. Badly decomposed, 2 bullet holes between the eyes described chillingly as execution style.
Just awful.
And the sources note that finding a letter addressed to Charles Whitehorn on that body is what led to his identification. So this detail highlights that Anna's disappearance wasn't isolated. Other Osage victims were being discovered right around the same time.
That's a really crucial point. It wasn't just one disappearance. And Anna Brown's body, Mollie's sister, was found shortly after this by some boys near a creek.
Oh, God.
The description is just stark and deeply disturbing. The undertaker who saw her body recalled it was swollen almost to the point of bursting and very malodorous. The source includes his horrific description of the body's color, using an abhorrent racial slur from the time. We are including this detail here as reported in the source material because it really starkly illustrates the pervasive and horrific racism of the era. It shows how dehumanizing attitudes were just intertwined with the violence. This language is, of course, completely unacceptable, but it was part of the reality these people faced.
That is just horrific to even read. And this finding triggered an inquest, didn't it? Led by a local justice of the peace and a jury of, well, white men.
Yep.
Their job was to determine if she died by an act of God or man, and doctors James and David Shown performed an autopsy.
And what's really striking here is the complete, utter lack of anything resembling modern forensic methods.
Right.
The sources are clear. No tire tracks were cast, no fingerprints dusted, no gunpowder residue checked, no photos taken, nothing.
And the scene was contaminated too, right? People just walking all over it.
Completely.
Yeah.
So this early investigation was severely hampered, whether that was through sheer incompetence or, well, perhaps deliberately so.
Anna was finally identified when one of her earrings was retrieved and shown to her sick mother, Lizzie. She instantly recognized it.
Heartbreaking.
And the initial inquest, it found her death, came at the hands of parties unknown. Just a total dead end, it felt like.
So as the Osage wealth continued to grow, this figure who had become absolutely central to the whole story rose to prominence. William K. Hale.
Ah, yes.
He arrived in the territory poor, but built himself up, became incredibly successful in the cattle business, accumulated huge amounts of land.
And he wasn't just some wealthy rancher. He really transformed his image, didn't he? Adopted the style of a gentleman, married a school teacher, actively gained significant political influence in the area.
Oh, yeah. He became known as the King of the Osage Hills.
Okay.
And he carefully cultivated this public image as, a benefactor. He donated to charities, signed letters as Reverend W.K. Hale.
Reverend Hale, seriously?
Seriously. The sources include accounts like a local doctor talking about countless sick people getting medical attention at Hale's expense. He even wrote to an assistant chief claiming he'd always be the Osage's true friend. Quite the performance.
Yet, alongside this carefully crafted public persona, a much, much darker picture starts to emerge from the sources.
Absolutely.
Mollie's testimony placed Anna leaving with Ernest's brother, Brian Burkhart, the night she vanished.
Ernest Burkhart being Mollie's husband, so her brother-in-law.
Exactly. And suspicion also fell on Anna's ex-husband, Oda Brown, described in the sources as absolutely no good and capable of doing almost anything for money, especially after he immediately tried to contest Anna's will.
Right. The timing is suspicious. And the inadequacy or maybe even the complicity of local law enforcement became increasingly apparent. Remember those doctors, the Shown brothers?
Yeah, who did the first autopsy?
They performed a second autopsy on Anna, described chillingly as cutting her head into sausage meat trying to find a bullet.
Oh my God.
Found nothing. And the justice of the peace just closed his inquiry. Little meaningful evidence gathered. It's just baffling.
And on top of all this violence, the Osage faced immense pressure to assimilate. Right. Abandoning their customs, even their traditional names for anglicized ones, like what happened with Mollie and her family.
Exactly. But the biggest systemic threat wasn't just cultural. It was financial and ultimately existential.
This is where the guardianship system comes in, and it's just horrifying.
It's absolutely crucial to understand this. The government basically viewing many Osage as incapable of managing their own sudden wealth.
Which is incredibly paternalistic and racist in itself.
Completely.
Yeah.
They imposed this system where white individuals were often appointed to control Osage finances. By 1921, even more draconian legislation was enacted, giving these guardians even greater power over the lives and money of their Osage wards.
This system wasn't just bureaucratic control. The sources detail how it created these perverse incentives and direct opportunities for exploitation and theft.
Exactly. Think about it. A white guardian gets legal control over a wealthy Osage person's money. The opportunities for abuse were just immense.
The sources detail horrific schemes like that case of the widow whose guardian just stole from her refused money for her sick baby.
Leading directly to the child's death.
Yeah.
The system didn't just enable theft, it created a motive for murder, especially if a guardian could inherit the headright of their ward upon their death.
Chilling.
And the murders continued, often in the shadows. William Stepson, an Osage deer rover, died of suspected strychnine poisoning in 1922.
Poisoning.
The sources note that poisoning was an ideal method at the time. It was easily available, silent, could mimic natural illness, often disguised in, bootleg whiskey.
And no real forensic science to detect it back then.
Exactly. There was no coroner trained in forensics who could easily detect it. This is another one of those early deaths that, in retrospect, really fits the pattern later revealed.
Then came the death of Henry Roan. His body was found shot in the head in a car. He was known to be a friend of Hale's, financially dependent on him, and had named Hale as the beneficiary of his $25,000 life insurance policy.
25 grand back then was a fortune.
Yeah. And the sources also mention that Mollie had actually been briefly married to Roan years earlier in an arranged Osage custom marriage. Small world, tragically interconnected.
And Hale, get this, Hale even served as a pallbearer at Roan's funeral.
No way.
The hypocrisy is just stunning. The sources reveal Hale was actively involved in securing that large insurance policy on Roan, despite Roan's poor health and heavy drinking. He even seemed to shop around for doctors who would approve the policy, claiming Roan owed him this debt that seemed, frankly, unbelievable.
Wow.
One doctor is quoted recalling asking Hale directly, "Bill, what are you going to do, kill this Indian?"
Oh my God, he actually asked him that.
He did. Shows you what people suspected even then.
This climate of terror must have just eaten away at the community. People suspecting everyone, including those closest to them. Bill Smith, who was Mollie's brother-in-law, married to her sister Rita.
Right.
He tried doing some detective work on his own, but he faced intimidation, intruders around their house. It got so bad they moved into a house near the center of Fairfax for safety, a house they'd actually bought from Dr. James Schoen, one of those autopsy doctors.
And less than a month after Henry Roan's death, that house in Fairfax was destroyed by a powerful explosion.
The bombing.
Rita was killed instantly. Bill was severely injured and died a few days later. The timing was incredibly suspicious. Local lawmen were conveniently away for a court case.
Deliberate, someone said.
An investigator is quoted noting the timing felt deliberate. This bombing brought the violence right into the heart of the town, out in the open.
By this point, the murders were gaining national attention, right?
Yeah.
But local and state efforts were just completely failing.
Utterly useless. Or worse. Governor Walton sent a state investigator, Herman Fox Davis.
Yeah.
Turned out he was corrupt himself, consorting with criminals, taking bribes instead of solving crimes. Just incredible.
So by 1923, the official death toll of tribal members linked to this violence was at least 24.
At least 24 known. And people who tried to help the investigation or simply knew too much also ended up dead. It wasn't just Osage dying.
The Literary Digest called it the Black Curse, and the press deemed it the bloodiest chapter in American crime history.
The wealthiest people per capita were becoming the world's most murdered. Just think about that contrast.
And Mollie, through all this, losing sister after sister, her brother-in-law, understandably she retreated. Her health began to fail. Her faith was shattered.
There are even whispers, the sources say, that she was going mad under the unbearable strain. She became so ill she actually gave her young child, Anna, to a relative to care for. Just unimaginable grief and fear.
Meanwhile, miles away in Washington, D.C., things are changing. National scandals like Teapot Dome were exposing deep corruption within the government.
Right, highlighting the urgent need for a capable, professional federal law enforcement agency. Changes were happening at the Bureau of Investigation, which was, the precursor to the FBI.
And in 1924, J. Edgar Hoover was appointed acting director.
Hoover, yeah. He lacked field experience, but was a creature of bureaucracy, intensely focused on building a modern, professional agency, and crucially, controlling its public image.
Right. He implemented significant reforms, raising standards for agents, standardizing procedures for gathering and filing evidence, making it more systematic.
And Hoover tasked Tom White, a former Texas Ranger known for his quiet investigative skills and reluctance to use violence, with leading the Osage investigation.
Tom White.
White was part of this small contingent of seasoned frontier lawmen Hoover kept on in the Bureau, known internally as the Cowboys. Old school, but effective.
So White's team adopted a different approach than the local guys.
Completely different. They used undercover operatives. They blended into Osage County under covers like cattlemen, insurance salesmen, even an Indian herb doctor.
Wow.
They worked discreetly, trying to build trust, gather information without alerting the killers, who clearly had eyes and ears everywhere.
Early on, though, they faced setbacks, right?
Yeah.
False leads, dead ends.
Oh, yeah. A theory that a woman named Rose Osage killed Anna out of jealousy. Disproven. A supposed confession from a Kaw Indian woman turned out to be fabricated by a white man.
Fabricated, so they weren't just hiding evidence.
They were actively manufacturing it to throw investigators off course. Shows you the level of planning and manipulation involved.
The investigation must have been incredibly difficult. The agents faced deep suspicion from the Osage, who had no reason to trust outsiders, especially white officials.
Exactly. Plus, pervasive corruption and the constant looming influence of William K. Hale. White and his team sometimes had to meet secretly out in the countryside, acutely aware they might be followed or exposed. The sources, quote, White advising his men, keep your balance, avoid any rough stuff if possible. But if you have to fight to survive, do a good job. Intense stuff.
Okay, but here's where it starts to turn. White's persistence began to pay off.
It did. There was a private detective named Pike. He'd originally been hired by Hale to basically conceal Brian Burkhart's whereabouts and manufacture alibis for Brian after Anna's murder.
Okay.
Pike eventually turned on Hale. He became a key informant, revealing Hale's direct involvement in ordering the conspiracy.
Wow, so Pike flipped.
And Pike also stated that Ernest Burkhart, Mollie's husband, was present at some of these planning meetings with Hale and Brian.
Ernest, involved from the beginning. Given his relationship with Mollie, that's chilling.
Absolutely chilling.
Yeah.
And then another critical breakthrough came with Bert Lawson, an outlaw incarcerated in McAllister Prison.
Okay.
White and Agent Frank Smith interviewed him, and Lawson confessed. William K. Hale had hired him, with assistance from Ernest Burkhart, to blow up Bill Smith's house.
The bombing. He confessed to the bombing.
Yes. He described getting dynamite from Hale, and Ernest driving him to the house and showing him exactly where to place the bomb.
Ernest drove him there.
That's what Lawson said. This confession was huge. It directly implicated Hale and Ernest in the bombing, a really concrete piece of the puzzle.
Must have felt like a major victory.
A huge sense of triumph for White and his team. But White knew more was needed to nail Hale for everything. He also grew deeply concerned around this time that Mollie herself was being systematically poisoned.
Oh, no. While under Ernest's care.
Exactly. A suspicion that was later confirmed when she dramatically regained her health after being removed from the care and control of Ernest and Hale.
So following Lawson's confession, Ernest and Hale were finally arrested.
Yep. And Hale, ever the showman, walked into the sheriff's office, dressed impeccably, announcing he was turning himself in, playing the role of the innocent man submitting to the law. Just incredible nerve.
And Ernest. Did he confess right away?
No, initially Ernest denied everything, but White pressed him, patiently, repeatedly. And then after a visit from Mollie, who apparently encouraged him to tell the truth, Ernest finally confessed.
What did he say?
He described how he had basically worshipped Hale, his Uncle Bill, as a boy and always followed his orders. He called Hale a schemer.
A schemer! That's putting it mildly.
Right. Ernest's confession laid bare the sheer callousness of the plot. He revealed Hale planned to kill Rita and Bill Smith, telling Ernest basically, what do you care? Your wife Mollie will get the money, referring to Mollie inheriting Rita's headright.
Unbelievable. He used Mollie's potential inheritance as a motive for Ernest.
Exactly. Ernest admitted hiring Lawson, getting the dynamite from Hale, driving Lawson there, burying the wrapper afterward. He even confessed to feeling sick, knowing Rita was inside the house, crying about it, and Hale just scoffing at him. God. Ernest also revealed that Hale had simply taken and used the money Ernest inherited from Rita and Bill. Yeah. And most chillingly, Ernest came to believe Hale planned to kill Mollie too, eventually. He called his uncle a devil incarnate.
A devil incarnate from his own nephew.
The pressure started mounting on others too. John Ramsey, a cow rustler associated with a criminal gang, also confessed.
Okay, Ramsey, what did you do?
He admitted Hale hired him to kill Henry Roan, the guy with the life insurance policy. Hired him for $1,000.
$1,000 to kill someone.
Ramsey described meeting Roan in a car with Hale, shooting the drunk Roan in the back of the head, and he even echoed Hale's chilling phrase, spearing fish in a keg.
Just cold-blooded.
And Ramsey attempted to justify it by saying white people in Oklahoma at the time thought no more of killing an Indian than they did in 1724. That quote just underscores the horrific racist attitudes fueling these crimes.
It's sickening. And then perhaps the most shocking revelation came from Ernest, right?
Right.
Regarding Anna's murder.
This one is just mind-blowing. Ernest revealed the identity of the mysterious third man seen with Anna just before her death.
Who was it?
Kelsey Morrison, who was, incredibly, the FBI's own paid informant, known to them as Slim Morrison.
Wait. The FBI's informant?
Yes. Morrison was a double agent. He was secretly feeding information back to Hale's network while pretending to work for the FBI.
Oh, my God.
Ernest revealed it was Morrison who put the fatal bullet in Anna Brown's head. Morrison himself later testified, graphically describing how Brian Burkhart helped him hold Anna up near the creek so Morrison could shoot her execution style.
An FBI informant carried out one of the key murders they were investigating.
Unbelievable betrayal, layered upon betrayal. Just staggering.
So, with confessions from Ernest, Ramsey, Morrison, and all this evidence pointing to Hale as the mastermind, it seemed like justice was finally within reach.
It seemed that way. However, the legal fight was far from over. These guys had influence, money, lawyers.
Right. There was a setback, wasn't there, with jurisdiction?
A significant one. A judge initially ruled the Roan murder fell under state, not federal, jurisdiction. This led to Hale and Ramsey's temporary release while the decision was appealed. One writer is quoted noting that Hale's lawyers had clipped the government's tail feathers good. It just highlights the influence Hale still wielded, even after arrest.
And the defense mounted a counteroffensive, didn't they? Getting people to recant.
Oh, yeah. They managed to get Ramsey and Ernest to recant their confessions before state trials, claiming they were coerced, made under duress. White recalled seeing Hale and Ramsey with these triumphant grins after the recantation. They thought they'd beaten it.
But the Supreme Court stepped in.
Eventually, yes. The Supreme Court ruled that the Roan murder was under federal jurisdiction because it happened on restricted Osage land. So Hale and Ramsey were rearrested.
Okay, back to federal court.
And in the subsequent federal trials, key co-conspirators like Ramsey and Morrison actually testified for the prosecution, detailing their roles and Hale's orders.
And Hale, the king, he testified.
He did. Testified in his own defense, coolly maintaining his innocence throughout. But the weight of the testimony, especially around the Roan insurance scheme and the Lawson confession about the bombing, was pretty significant.
Did it work? Were there convictions?
Well, the first federal trial of Hale actually ended in a hung jury.
Hung jury. After all that.
Yep. The foreman later reported bribery attempts. The sources note it seemed almost impossible to find 12 white men who would convict one of their own for murdering American Indians in that time and place.
That's deeply disturbing.
Brian Burkhart's trial for Anna's murder also resulted in a hung jury initially. The Osage were understandably outraged, furious. There were even murmurs about taking justice into their own hands, requiring Tom White to deploy agents to protect Hale at one point. Imagine that.
Protecting the man who orchestrated the murders? Wow. But White didn't give up.
No, Tom White was persistent. He continued to investigate the corruption in that first trial, uncovering evidence of bribery, perjury, even threats from a defense attorney.
So they went back to trial.
They did. And eventually, despite all the setbacks, the corruption, the intimidation, Hale, Ramsey, Brian Burkhart, Kelsey Morrison, and Ernest Burkhart were convicted in various trials. They received sentences including life imprisonment.
Finally.
These were hard-fought and really significant convictions, especially marking a rare instance back then of white men being federally convicted for killing American Indians.
J. Edgar Hoover certainly used the Osage case to great effect, didn't he? Built the FBI's reputation on it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He leveraged it to build the Bureau's image as this modern, scientifically skilled force capable of solving complex crimes.
Yeah.
It became a kind of origin story for the FBI, overcoming frontier lawlessness, bringing order.
But the sources reveal that public narrative, well, it concealed earlier Bureau bungling, like the Morrison informant issue.
Right.
And crucially, the fact that the investigation basically stopped after catching Hale's immediate circle, leaving many, many other murders unsolved.
Exactly. It was a partial victory framed as a total one. And Tom White, despite the immense hardship and danger of the Osage investigation, he went on to become the warden of Leavenworth Prison, known as the Hot House.
Warden, wow.
Yeah, he was known for trying to improve conditions, encourage rehabilitation. Grimly ironic, he even oversaw the execution of a serial killer, echoing his own father's work as a lawman. White himself was later taken hostage during a prison escape. He survived.
What a life. Did he oversee Hale in prison?
He did. Hale served time at Leavenworth while White was warden, and White ensured Hale was treated fairly, despite everything. Professionalism, I suppose.
And what happened to Hale and Ernest in the end?
Hale was eventually paroled in 1947, served only about 20 years.
20 years for masterminding all that.
Largely due to his age and supposedly good behavior. Osage leaders protested vehemently, seeing it as a sign of his lingering influence. He was forbidden from returning to Oklahoma, but reportedly boasted he'd be rich if Ernest had just kept his mouth shut.
Unbelievable. And Ernest.
Ernest was also paroled eventually, but tragically he went back to prison later after robbing an Osage home. Sad end.
But the most haunting and frankly profound aspect revealed by the author's deeper research, which you shared, is the true scale of the hidden tragedy.
Yes, this is what stays with you. The Bureau officially estimated 24 Osage murders linked to the conspiracy, but the author's findings show the real number was undoubtedly higher, likely far higher.
How much higher?
Scores, maybe hundreds. The investigation essentially stopped after catching Hale's primary group, but the agents involved knew many more killings were systematically covered up.
How were they covered up? The sources detail some methods, right?
Yeah, chilling methods beyond just shootings and bombings. One involved getting an Osage person intoxicated, having a compliant doctor certify drunkenness, then injecting them with morphine, and later a fatal overdose after the doctor left.
And the cause of death listed?
Alcoholic poison, falsely. Other suspicious deaths were attributed to vague things like wasting illness or simply causes unknown.
Convenient.
Incredibly convenient. Scholars who've looked at the death rates during that period found them to be starkly higher than the national average for this community that was supposedly the wealthiest in the world. It just doesn't add up without acknowledging widespread murder.
And the author's research uncovered specific heartbreaking cases that were never fully addressed by the FBI's convictions, right? Cases like William Stepson.
Right. His grandson, Marvin Stepson, who's now an Osage judge, confirmed through family knowledge that Kelsey Morrison, the FBI informant, killed his grandfather.
Oh, Morrison again?
And even more disturbingly, Morrison later married Marvin's grandmother, Tilly, poisoned her to inherit her estate, and left Marvin's father an orphan.
Oh my God, he married her and then killed her.
Yeah. Morrison even planned to sell parts of this swindled estate to H.G. Burt, the banker who was tied to the murder of an attorney, W.W. Vaughn, who had been investigating the conspiracy himself. It suggests a much wider network of complicity.
It wasn't just Hale's family then. And there was another case, Paul Peace.
Carl Peace, yeah. His granddaughter, Mary Jo Webb, shared documents showing Peace suspected his white wife was poisoning him. He sought to divorce her, change his will through a decent attorney named Comstock. Weeks later, he died after a suspicious hit-and-run that was covered up. Webb points to a network of doctors, brothers likely involved in providing the poison. It just keeps pointing to this web of corruption.
These individual stories just underscore that the conspiracy wasn't just Hale and his immediate circle. It involved a whole network, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, guardians, all exploiting and murdering Osage people for their wealth.
Exactly. And the author's journey researching this history, meeting descendants like Mollie's granddaughter, Mollie Burkhart, and others, it reveals a trauma that has just ravaged generations.
Margie shared with the author how her father, Cowboy Burkhart, Ernest's son, was haunted by what his own father had done, yet deeply adored his mother, Mollie.
Imagine carrying that legacy.
Yeah, Margie herself worried about being a bad seed because of her ancestry. She and her family would watch TV programs about the FBI solving the case and just cry, knowing the deeper truth that the official story was so incomplete that so many victims were left out.
Visiting the Osage Nation today, you see incredible resilience. They administer their own justice in their courts. They preserve their vibrant culture through dances like the Anwanchka. Yet the visible signs of the past remain. Like the abandoned buildings of Fairfax, once a bustling boomtown, now described as almost a ghost town. A stark reminder of that era.
Margie took the author to the graveyard where Mollie is buried, alongside her murdered sisters, her mother, her brother-in-law, and her first husband, Henry Roan.
Altogether, victims of the same plot.
Seeing those graves stacked there, Margie just asked what kind of person could do this, a question that hangs in the air.
And she also showed the author the spot near a ravine where Anna was shot, a place her own father had shown her, describing it as kind of scary. The landscape itself holds the memory of the violence.
As Mary Jo Webb put it so powerfully, this land is saturated with blood. Echoing that biblical line, the blood cries out from the ground.
Chilling.
Catherine Redcorn, the director of the Osage Nation Museum, even shared a letter Hale wrote from prison years later, still claiming to be the Osage's true friend.
Still claiming that. After everything.
Yeah, a chilling look at his utter lack of remorse or acknowledgement. Her own grandfather's story of suspected poisoning just adds yet another layer to the pervasive fear and the hidden death toll.
The Osage today, as described in that beautiful ballet, Osage, they walk in two worlds, holding on to their culture while navigating modern society, their history, and this profound trauma deeply ingrained, never forgotten.
What an absolutely gripping and just devastating story of wealth, vulnerability, systemic corruption, and such deep, deep betrayal. This deep dive into the sources around Killers of the Flower Moon really reveals a level of calculated, systematic evil targeting an entire community just for their resource.
It really highlights just how easily justice can be subverted, delayed by greed, influence, and just plain racism, and how official narratives, even those of celebrated agencies like the FBI, can sometimes present a cleaner, more convenient picture than the messy, painful, and often incomplete reality.
The book and the core FBI investigation tells the crucial story of the solved cases, the key players brought to justice by Tom White's team. That's important. But the author's further research, shared in the sources you provided, uncovers that horrific hidden dimension, the many, many other Osage who likely died suspicious deaths, never investigated, their stories lost to official records and deliberate cover-ups.
It's a stark, vital reminder that the full truth of history can be elusive. It can be buried under layers of time, corruption, denial, leaving descendants like Mollie Burkhart, Marvin Stepson, Mary Jo Webb to piece together their family histories and fight to ensure all the victims are remembered and honored.
So what does this all mean for us? Thinking about it today, perhaps it's that history isn't just about the events that make the headlines or fill the official files of government agencies.
Right.
It's also about the stories hidden beneath the surface, the intergenerational trauma carried by communities, and the very land itself that remembers the blood spilled upon it. It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How many other stories like this, stories of systemic injustice and hidden victims, remain untold or only partially known?
A provocative thought indeed, and one that definitely encourages us all to keep looking beyond the surface narratives we're given and questioning the history we think we know.